Hi everyone, my name's Eleanor and I'm the Education Manager at Benjamin Franklin House. Welcome to this week's live history class, and today we're going to be talking all about Georgian education and etiquette. So as ever, we're so excited that you can join us today, and we're looking forward to your participation during the class. A reminder that you can do this in a couple of ways. If you press your raise hand button, then I can unmute your microphone and you can speak over the audio. Or if you prefer to type, you can write in the chat or the Q&A section as well. And hi to Claire, who I can see is joining us too. We are recording today's session, so if you're watching this on our website or on YouTube, you can always get in touch with any questions by emailing education@benjaminfranklinhouse.org. So before we get on to the topic at hand, let's just have a reminder of who Benjamin Franklin was and what he was doing in London. So I can see some familiar names. Can anyone who's joining us remind us who Ben was and what they know about him and what he was doing coming to this house in London? Hi to Enid and Harriet as well. So Claire has said that he was a founding father. That's quite right. That's probably what he was best known for. But he was known for several things throughout his lifetime. And since we're thinking about education today, I wonder if anyone knows anything about his childhood and what kind of education Benjamin Franklin had himself. I can see Enid has a raised hand. Let me go to that. Hi, Enid.
Hi. I know that he invented swim fins at a very young age.
He did. He was very curious, and so he started his inventions because that's one of the other things he did, wasn't it? He was a scientist when he was quite young. Thanks, Enid. Let's see in the chat as well. So hello to Esther, Elijah, Talitha, and Liliana, and you said we think he was home educated. So you're kind of half right. He went to school for 2 years. But his family were craftsmen and he needed to go and work at quite a young age. So he went to school from the age of 8 to the age of 10. And then he went and did an apprenticeship to become a printer. And that was with his older brother, James. And then he went off and started his own printing press and really made his fortune that way. But in terms of being home educated, you're right, he was very, he taught himself a lot. He was a great lover of reading and very curious. And as Enid mentioned, he was always investigating things, and that was how he came to make lots of inventions, as he was a scientist too. And someone else has mentioned he was a politician, and that's what led him to be remembered as one of the founding fathers of the United States. And it was his work as a politician that really brought him to London to live in the house you can see on the right of the screen on Craven Street that we call Benjamin Franklin House today. And on the left, we have a lovely illustration by our illustration resident, Kamina Dimitrova, of Franklin writing in his parlour, which is this room where these 3 windows are on Craven Street. You can see another raised hand. Hi, Enid.
Hi, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Was Benjamin Franklin friends with Alexander Hamilton?
That's a really good question. Thank you, Enid. And some of you other participants joining might have heard of Hamilton. He's been made very famous recently because there's a very popular musical called Hamilton, and that's now available on Disney+. So when there was the revolution, so Benjamin Franklin came to London in the years before that happened. So he came to live on Craven Street when America was still part of England. And then when he left in 1775, there was the War of Independence and America broke away and became an independent country. And as that was happening, there were lots of meetings of what we now remember as the founding fathers, including Hamilton. So they would have been in the same room. We don't know that they were friends exactly, but they would have been in the same places because they were both a part of that process of deciding the laws and the ideals of this newly independent country of the United States. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And just to add that, so by the time that was happening, Benjamin Franklin was quite an old man. He was one of the older founding fathers, whereas Alexander Hamilton was very young. So there was quite an age gap between them. But Benjamin Franklin was certainly friends with some of the other well-known founding fathers like Washington, and particularly Thomas Jefferson, who was the main founding father behind writing the Declaration of Independence. But let's come on now to our topic of the week, education and etiquette during the Georgian period. And we kind of touched on this in a previous class when we were thinking about family life and the life of children during this time. We remember the Georgian period as that period from about 1715 to 1830. So Benjamin Franklin was living in London at this time. And I've got a question for you, thinking about lots of those questions we'll ask as historians. So always comparing the past with the present, how do you think education in the Georgian period was different from today? What do you think? Do feel free to raise your hand or to write in the chat. Right, so Claire has said there was nothing electronic. So of course, particularly right now, a lot of remote learning, we're using electricity and devices a lot of the time. Hi, Enid.
Hi. I thought that more boys would be going to school than girls. And
That's
girls,
a really,
and girls would be learning from home and learning like how to take care of a household, while boys would be learning like how to ride horses and how to write and read.
Very good point. And we're going to come on to that, how education was different for girls and boys. Thank you so much. And again, thinking back to previous classes, we've spoken a bit about how there were different social classes. So the upper classes, the middle classes, and the lower classes, and which class you were part of really affected your education as well. You can see Xavier has a raised hand too. Hello.
Did only the rich people go to school?
That's a great question. So if you were rich and part of the upper classes or the upper middle classes, you were more likely to go to school. But we're going to be looking at how there were certain different schools for those families that weren't so wealthy as well. So
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Let's see the chat as well. Oh, brilliant. So I can see that someone has said that there was this focus on the 3 R's. We're going to be coming back to that, what that means, and how they learn Latin, and the fact that people will do apprenticeships. Really good points. Claire has mentioned how there were different rules around punishment and how there might be some quite strict punishments if you misbehaved in school. You're quite right. So let's have a look at all of those things. We're going to start by looking at the upper classes, and as Enid brought up, thinking about the differences in education for boys and for girls. And they would have learned different history too. Very, very good points, everyone. You know so much already. So let's start by thinking about upper class boys. So as I said, a lot of upper class boys, they probably would have initially learnt, they would have had a tutor, maybe who would have lived at the house, at home, and they would have started learning quite young. But then from the age of about 13, most upper class boys would have gone to these special schools that were really for the elite. And confusingly, they were called public schools because when they were first founded, they were supposed to be open for all, but eventually they would become fee-paying and quite exclusive. And many of these schools still exist today. And they were mostly boarding schools. So if you attended, you would be staying there. And boys would stay there mostly from the age of 13 to the age of 18. And in terms of what they studied, someone mentioned Latin, and there was this real focus on what we call the classics. So ancient history, classical languages like Latin and also ancient Greek. They would learn also some more modern languages from Europe, so particularly French and Italian. And there would be, of course, reading and some arithmetic, also lots of Bible studies. And it would be quite a long day at school. They would wake up around 7 a.m. and may have classes and different activities going up until 8 p.m., 9 p.m. at night. And a lot of that, incorporated into that, there would be lots of prayers and services as well. So all those different things going on. We've got some lovely images on the screen. So on the left here we have, so sport could be very important to these schools. And this is an early cricket bat and stumps here. And you can see he's got this very smart coat on. So most of these schools, to kind of mark the students out as members of their community, would have these special uniforms. And on the right, we have a picture of inside one of these schools. This is Rugby School. And as I mentioned, many of these famous public schools still exist today. Rugby, in fact, exists, and it's where we think the sport rugby came from as well. So some of the systems in place in the school, someone mentioned punishment, and it's true that if a boy misbehaved or didn't do their work well, then they might be beaten with a cane. So very different from today, where that's definitely not allowed in schools. And many of these schools would have their kind of particular customs and maybe even slang, so particular language that the students would use to one another. And normally, once boys had left these schools, they would go on to university. And often there would be particular schools that would send their students to perhaps a university like Oxford, and then other schools would send their students to a university like Cambridge. And certain students, that wouldn't be the right route for them, so they might then go into the military. Because if we think back to the class we did about society and class, there were only certain occupations that were seen as appropriate for the upper classes. So military was one of those. And at university, the boys might study to become priests, vicars, or they might become politicians and lawyers and judges, those kind of roles. So that's upper class boys. And do let me know if you have any questions if we're going through. Let's come to think about girls now and how that was different. So as we were saying, it was quite different for girls, and there was a different emphasis on the subjects that they'd be taught. So although most girls would be taught at home, maybe with a governess or a tutor, schools for girls did exist as well. So we can see that particularly in the picture on the right. And most of these schools would also be boarding schools, so the girls would be staying there. But as we said, there was a different emphasis on the subjects that they really learned, and there was a lot of emphasis on preparing them to take care of their household. So they'd have some basic literacy and also arithmetic skills, so they could manage the house accounts and things. But there would be a real focus as well on the step before that, so kind of preparing them for marriage, and so this idea of female accomplishment. So that might include playing instruments and singing. So on the left, we can see in this picture, the parents are showing off their musical skills of one of their daughters who's been away to school. They would also probably learn needlework and embroidery, maybe some small bits of foreign languages, but probably not to the same extent as the boys as well. I can see there was a raised hand. Let me go to that. Hi, Enid.
Hi. Weren't there special boarding schools for girls that taught them how to be proper ladies?
Right, so brilliant. So in fact, these boarding schools, they had a special name, and they were normally called seminaries. And again, there'd be quite a religious nature to these schools. And yes, part of their training in school, as I said, was kind of preparing them to take care of the household and for marriage. And part of that would be the proper manners that they would need to learn. And we'll come on to that in the next slide, where we're going to be thinking about etiquette as well. So at this time, and if you joined us for the last session in over the Easter holidays, where we had a guest from Newington Green Meeting House, and we spoke a bit about a famous historical figure called Mary Wollstonecraft. So at this time, as we said, there was this quite big difference between the education of men and women, but we were starting to see some kind of educational reformers like Wollstonecraft, who were saying that women should be learning other things too. So lots of interesting change at this time. Hi, Enid.
Hi. I was wondering if you knew who that little guy in the blue suit carrying the big birthday cake looking thing in the corner of
yes.
the one with the extremely large parents showing off their daughters?
Yeah, exactly. So this is an example of one of those caricature drawings that I quite often use in the class. So everything's a bit exaggerated because it's meant to be funny, and it's kind of poking fun at the parents kind of showing off their daughter in this way. So that's why there's slightly strange proportions, and some of them are very large and some of them are small. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant. Okay, so I've got a question for you now, which is it's a part of the title of the class, but I wonder if anyone knows already what I mean by the word etiquette, because that was a really important part of education for all of the classes, but particularly the upper classes and particularly upper class girls. You can see some raised hands. That's great. Hi, Xavier.
Is it attitude or behavior?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. So there are certain behaviours that were seen as acceptable for certain classes, and kind of rules, particularly around social interaction, that you had to go by if you were going to be sort of accepted in society. Oh, and Esther, Elijah, Talitha, and Liliana have said the correct way to behave. Exactly. So let's have a little think about etiquette. So at the time, as I said, there were these very strict rules around social interactions for all of the classes, but particularly in the upper classes. And particularly around social interactions, specifically between men and women. So for example, when you were out in public place, perhaps in a park or those pleasure gardens that we talked about in a previous class, you couldn't really interact with other people unless you've been introduced by someone that you both knew, and a woman should only hold the arm of a male companion if it was someone she knew well, like a brother or her husband. And then you'd have these society occasions like balls, as you can see in the image on the left, and dinners on the right. So again, there were all sorts of rules around this. With the balls, you would have to ask somebody if they would have a dance with you, and it wasn't seen to be a very good thing if you danced with someone more than once. And then on the right, thinking about the dinner, all sorts of rules around this. So women weren't allowed to serve themselves, and women were meant to wear their napkins on their lap, whereas men were meant to wear their napkins kind of tucked into their collar. So all sorts of rules that are very different to how we interact today, but was a big part of education at the time, particularly for those upper classes. But different societal classes had their different rules to live by as well. So I've got another question for you now. We've spoken about how education was different for upper class boys and girls, but thinking about the middle and lower classes now, how do you think it would have been different for them? Hi, Enid.
Hi. I believe that it would be different because they would have much less education than higher classes, and that from today too.
Yeah, definitely. So less than high classes, and also today we really have much more universal education. It's something that we see as really important. So at the time, so it wasn't until the beginning of the 19th century, so about 100 years after Benjamin Franklin was living in London, that there were some laws passed in England, at least, that said that everyone should be getting an education. So very different times. Xavier, hello.
Hi. I don't think any of them could read or write.
You're right that wouldn't be common, and that we're going to see how there were some sorts of schools that the middle and lower classes could go to as well. That it would be more common amongst the middle classes to be able to read and write as well. Thank you. Let me see the chat as well. So Claire said less money to pay for education. So and not being able to pay for private tutors. Exactly. So let's look at some of the other options that were available for the middle classes and the lower classes. So we spoke about those public schools. It's a very confusing name though, actually, because they were very elite and would have big fees eventually. But there were also grammar schools, and we've got a picture of one here. so Queen Elizabeth's Free Grammar School, and this picture is from 1815, so towards the end of the Georgian period. And these were schools that were mostly free. There were some later grammar schools that would charge fees, and they were set up mostly with the funds from wealthy merchants who were sort of part of the upper middle classes. And most of these students would be able to attend for free. And the name grammar school, it comes from the fact that originally, again, they also focused a lot on those classical languages and thinking about the grammar. But considering the types of students that were attending and the fact that a lot of them would be going on to become tradesmen or to have a craft, then actually the emphasis shifted from those classical languages to more commercial skills like arithmetic, thinking about accounting again, and other things that would be useful for them. I can see there's a comment in the chat. And someone's brought up about workhouses, so we'll come on to those as well. So there were grammar schools, and then also there was something called dame schools, and they could vary quite a lot. They were much more informal. They'd normally be in somebody's house, so it might be an elderly woman or a retired soldier, and they would, for quite a small fee, so it would be possible for some middle-class families to send their children to these. They would teach children, and really with their focus on the 3 R's that someone mentioned earlier. So that's reading, writing, and arithmetic. So still a real focus of our education system today, making sure we have all of those core skills. And so here we have a picture showing a dame school on the right. So you can see there's quite a lot of children in quite a small space. And it would have been more informal. And whereas with the upper class public schools, most students were there from 13 to 18. With the dame schools, that it might not be for such a long period of time, thinking back to how Benjamin Franklin only went to school for 2 years. And thinking of university, although many upper class children would go on to attend university. When I say children, I should say boys. Women didn't go to university until, again, about 100 years after Benjamin Franklin was in London. The first women to go to university, that was in, I've written it down somewhere, it was 9 women who went to, they went to University College London, which is still a university that exists today. And it was in the late 1800s, 1868. So 9 women being the first to attend university. But for middle class children, it would still be possible to attend. Often they might have to win scholarships. So quite a few weeks ago now, in the February half term, we had a visitor from John Wesley's house, who was a famous preacher during the Georgian period. And he wasn't from such a wealthy family, but he did go to university. He went to Cambridge. Because he was able to get a scholarship. So there were ways for middle-class children to go to university, and that might then lead to them kind of moving up those social classes as well. So as someone mentioned the workhouses, let's come on now to the lower class children. So as we've spoken quite a lot in previous classes about how the population in cities was really growing, and over the 18th century, there were many more efforts to provide schooling for those lower class families. So someone mentioned how some of those families might have to be in the workhouses, and they might receive something called poor relief. So this would be given out by the churches in each area, the parishes, and the money would be given by people who own property in that area to provide some basic education. And many of these early schools for the lower classes would also have a connection with the church. And so a lot of the studies might be around the Bible, a lot of the reading practice would be from the Bible. And then with the growth of cities, there was the creation of these schools called ragged schools. And we have some pictures. It's actually just after the Georgian period, from a newspaper. So in Lambeth, which is an area in London, and we can see a girls' ragged school on the left and a boys' ragged school on the right. So you can see now it is really quite crowded. And these schools, the teachers would normally be volunteers, and they would take place in quite makeshift spaces. So they might be under railway arches or in lofts or in stables. So not always such an ideal place to learn, but of course, wonderful that more children had access to education. And so then at the end of the 19th century, that's when there was the Elementary Education Act, and more and more people were having access to education. But even in these middle and lower classes with these different educational options, there was a difference between boys and girls. So the boys would have that, they both have that focus on the 3 R's, but with girls, again, there'd be that thinking about singing and needlework as well, because if they were to go on to have roles as servants, perhaps, then needlework might be important as well. So we're coming towards the end of the class now. I've got an activity that I was going to suggest you might like to try following this class, but does anyone have any questions they wanted to ask before that? So someone's asking, is that why they were taught separately? So it was partly to do with that, the fact that they had kind of different curriculums, different subjects that would be focused on. And also thinking back to that etiquette and how boys and girls were really kept quite separate at this time. And there were certain rules around how they would interact. Claire's asked, what was the hygiene like? That's a very important question. So it probably wouldn't have been so good in these ragged schools, also possibly in those dame schools as well, that were just in people's houses. And we're coming on next week, or not next week, at the next class, which is actually in 3 weeks' time. We're going to look at health and hygiene, medicine in the Georgian period. So we'll come back to that then. I can see some raised hands. Hi, Enid.
Question.
Yeah.
Is that from like one of those comics that they sometimes had in the newspapers?
Did these pictures come from a comic?
Yeah, like sometimes they have those comics that you sometimes show us from the Georgian period, and I was wondering if that was
where they come from. No, it's not from. It's not like the one we saw of the family where the daughter was playing the piano. It's not quite as exaggerated. This is from an article writing about the ragged schools, and so it's more informational. It's trying to give an idea of what it's like in those schools.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. You can see it's in black and white as well, so more formal and informational. Someone's asked if did they get food at schools? Yes, so in these schools for the lower classes, that might be an element of it, although really the focus was on the education. In those public schools and grammar schools, they would have been getting fed, particularly as it was boarding school. So they would definitely need their meals there. You can see another raised hand. Hello.
Hi, I noticed that there is the boys are teaching the adults. So the men are teaching the boys and the women are teaching the girls. Why is that?
Yeah, it's a really really good point. And someone was asking about why they were kept separate, and it was all kind of part of that etiquette we were talking about. And so you think that the women have been educated in a certain way, they can then pass on to their female students, and similarly with the men. So hopefully that answers your question. But as I said, there were some female educators who were arguing that education should be a bit different for women, and less of a focus on what they called the kind of ornamental subjects, so things like singing and playing instruments. So someone's noticed that there's one of the commandments that thou shalt not steal from the Bible on the wall. So again, thinking about how there was a real connection, in fact, throughout all the schools of all the different societal classes. But yes, particularly that was a lot of these schools were from set up by charitable giving, so people wanting to help those who were less fortunate than themselves. So someone's asked, who are the people looking over the banisters? I think that's at the back of this picture of the boys' school. I think certainly this gentleman is teaching as well. So you can see there's kind of different teachers teaching different groups of boys in this picture. Check if there's any more raised hands. Hi, Enid.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you for this class. My little sister also said thank you, and it was a wonderful class.
Oh, thank you, Ina. Thank you for joining, and thanks everyone for all your brilliant participation. Let me just check. So someone's asked, I mentioned how the next class is in 3 weeks. So that's because there are lots of Thursdays in April, and the classes are on the 2nd and 4th Thursday of the month. So because there's a 5th Thursday in April, we're going to wait 3 weeks for the next one. Thank you so much, everyone, for your kind comments. Before I go, I'll just suggest, if you like, there's an idea for an activity. So one of the things that they would have had to do in Georgian times was that, I think, practice their handwriting. And here's an example of in schools in England anyway today, there is this push to write with cursive hand, but here's an example from the 18th century of some cursive handwriting. So if you wanted, you might want to try practicing those cursive letters, and you can see at the bottom it says "Take great care and you'll write fair." So on our website, on the event page, there's a link to this image, and I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that I can share it with you now as well.